At 11:30 hours on May 3, 1946, HMS Vanguard slid down the slipway at John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland, entering the Clyde River for the first time. The launch had been delayed 18 months beyond the original schedule. The battleship was supposed to enter service in late 1944 when British naval power in the Pacific might still require modern capital ships. Instead, she was being launched 10 months after Japan surrendered, entering a world where battleships were obsolete. The ship displaced 420 tons fully loaded, making her the largest battleship ever built for the Royal Navy, exceeding even the 360-ton displacement of the King George V class. Her dimensions were equally impressive: 814 feet long, 108 feet wide, 36 feet draft. She carried 8 15-inch Mark I guns in 4 twin turrets, 16 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns in 8 twin turrets, and 73 smaller anti-aircraft weapons. Her armor protection included a 14-inch belt, 6-inch deck, and 13-inch turret faces. But the most remarkable aspect of HMS Vanguard was what she represented: the end of a naval tradition stretching back centuries. She was the last battleship completed by any navy anywhere in the world. No nation would ever build another. The age of the battleship was ending precisely as Britain launched its finest example. The irony was that Vanguard's main battery, those 8 15-inch guns, were older than most of her crew. The guns had been manufactured in 1914-1916 for the Courageous-class battlecruisers Courageous and Glorious. Both ships had been converted to aircraft carriers in the 1920s. Their guns had been removed and stored at Woolwich Arsenal for 20 years, waiting for a purpose. That purpose became Vanguard. The decision to reuse 30-year-old guns on Britain's newest battleship was born from desperation and calculation. In 1939, when the Admiralty first conceived Vanguard, Britain faced a simple problem: insufficient battleship strength to fight Germany, Italy, and potentially Japan simultaneously. The King George V class would provide 5 modern battleships by 1942, but 5 was inadequate. The Royal Navy needed additional capital ships immediately. Building battleships required time Britain did not have. New 16-inch guns took 4 years to manufacture, from raw castings to finished weapons. The King George V class used 14-inch guns specifically because 14-inch weapons could be produced faster than 16-inch, but even 14-inch production was constrained. British industry could not produce enough heavy guns for both the King George V class and additional battleships. The solution was to reuse existing guns. The 15-inch Mark I was available in storage, proven through World War I service, and still effective against modern armor at tactical ranges. 4 twin turrets existed at Woolwich Arsenal, enough for 1 battleship. If a ship could be designed around these turrets, construction time would be reduced from 5 years to 3 years. The ship could be operational by 1942, when Britain would need every capital ship available. This was the genesis of Vanguard. She would be Britain's emergency battleship, built faster than conventional construction by using existing guns and simplified design. The plan was rational. In 1939. It became problematic when delays pushed her completion date from 1942 to 1946. Construction began at John Brown's Clydebank shipyard on October 2, 1941. The yard had extensive experience with battleship construction, having built Hood Repulse and Duke of York. Vanguard was assigned construction number 534, the same number that had been assigned to Cunard liner Queen Mary, suggesting the shipyard's expectation that this would be a prestigious project. But construction proceeded slowly. Resources were prioritized for more urgent needs: destroyers, corvettes, landing craft, merchant ships. Battleships were important, but not critical when Britain was fighting for survival against U-boats in the Atlantic. Vanguard's keel was laid, but work progressed intermittently as workers and materials were diverted to more immediate priorities. The 4 twin 15-inch turrets presented unique challenges. The turrets had been designed in 1914 for battlecruiser installation. Battlecruiser turrets were lighter than battleship turrets, using thinner armor to reduce weight. Installing them on a battleship meant they would be vulnerable to enemy fire from battleships with heavier guns. The armor had to be upgraded. The upgrade required adding supplementary armor plates to the turret faces and roofs. The additional armor increased each turret's weight from 750 tons to 896 tons. This weight increase affected the ship's design. The hull had to be strengthened to support the heavier turrets. The magazine arrangements had to be reconfigured to handle the increased weight. The stability calculations had to be reworked. The 15-inch Mark I guns themselves required refurbishment. They had been in storage since 1924, exposed to varying humidity and temperature. Some showed surface corrosion. All needed inspection to ensure the barrels had not degraded. Each gun was disassembled, inspected, machined to remove corrosion, and reassembled. The process took months per gun. The gun's performance was well understood from World War I service. They fired a 1,920-pound armor-piercing shell to maximum range of 33,550 yards at 20-degree elevation. Muzzle velocity was 2,450 feet per second. Rate of fire was approximately 2 rounds per minute. These specifications were adequate but not exceptional compared to newer designs. American 16-inch guns fired 2,700-pound shells to 42,000 yards. Japanese 18.1-inch guns on Yamato fired 220-pound shells to 45,000 yards. But the 15-inch Mark I had advantages. The guns were proven reliable and familiar to Royal Navy gunners who had trained on similar weapons. The ammunition was already in production for other ships using 15-inch guns. The fire control systems were mature, debugged through decades of service. Using these guns eliminated technical risk at the cost of accepting inferior performance. Vanguard's secondary armament was completely modern. 16 5.25-inch Mark I guns and 8 twin DP. Mark the SIN mountings provided anti-aircraft and anti-destroyer capability. The 5.25-inch gun was the Royal Navy's standard heavy anti-aircraft weapon used on King George V-class battleships and Dido-class cruisers. It fired a 82-pound shell to 46,000 feet altitude at maximum elevation. Rate of fire was 10 to 12 rounds per minute per gun. The close-range anti-aircraft battery was the most powerful ever fitted to a British battleship. 73 weapons total, including 6 octuple 2-pounder pom-poms, 48 barrels total, 11 quadruple 40mm Bofors, 44 barrels total, and 15 single 20mm Oerlikons. This represented lessons learned from the Pacific War, where Japanese kamikaze attacks demonstrated that battleships needed overwhelming anti-aircraft firepower. Armor protection followed the Royal Navy's traditional all-or-nothing scheme: heavy armor over vital areas, minimal armor elsewhere. The main belt was 14 inches thick over machinery and magazines tapering to 4.5 inches at the ends. The armored deck was 6 inches thick over magazines, 5 inches over machinery. Turret faces were 13 inches turret sides, 11 inches turret roofs, 7.25 inches. The conning tower was 13 inches thick. This armor scheme was designed to resist 15-inch shells at ranges between 12,000 and 30,000 yards. Against 16-inch or 18-inch shells, the protection was marginal. American Iowa-class battleships with 16-inch guns could penetrate Vanguard's belt at ranges beyond 20,000 yards. Japanese Yamato with 18.1-inch guns could penetrate at any tactical range. Vanguard was designed to fight German or Italian battleships armed with 15-inch or 16-inch guns, not to engage American or Japanese super battleships. Construction continued through 1942-1945 at gradually increasing priority. By 1944, the Pacific War made heavy ships relevant again. The Royal Navy was deploying battleships to the British Pacific Fleet, supporting operations against Japan. Vanguard might be needed. Work accelerated. By early 1945, the hull was complete, machinery was being installed, and turrets were being mounted. Then, the war ended. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Construction of Vanguard was 90% complete. Canceling the project would waste the resources already invested. The Admiralty decided to complete her reasoning that a modern battleship would be useful for peacetime duties even if she never fought in combat. The launch on May 3, 1946, was ceremonial rather than celebratory. Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, Elizabeth II performed the launch ceremony christening the ship by breaking a bottle of champagne on the bow. The crowd was modest compared to pre-war battleship launches. The press coverage was limited. The Royal Navy was disbanding hundreds of warships, scrapping older vessels, reducing from wartime strength of 500 ships to peacetime strength of approximately 300. Launching a new battleship seemed anachronistic. Fitting out continued for another 20 months. The work was methodical, unhurried. There was no urgency. The ship would not deploy to combat operations. She would serve as training ship, prestige vessel, and royal yacht when required. Perfection was more important than speed. Vanguard was commissioned on April 25, 1946, during fitting out, allowing her to be listed as operational on the Navy list. But she did not complete sea trials until April 1946. The trials revealed excellent handling characteristics. The ship was stable, maneuvered responsively, maintained speed in rough seas. The machinery was quiet, producing less vibration than older battleships. The living spaces were the most comfortable ever provided on a British capital ship, with central heating, improved ventilation, and better sanitation than pre-war battleships. But the trials also confirmed what had been obvious from her conception: she was a World War I-era design completed in the jet age. Her 15-inch guns were adequate against World War II surface threats that no longer existed. Her anti-aircraft battery was powerful but designed against piston-engine aircraft when jets were entering service. Her armor was designed against naval gunfire when the primary threat to surface ships was now aircraft and missiles. HMS Vanguard's operational career reflected her anachronism. She never fired her main battery in combat. She never engaged enemy vessels. She served primarily as training ship and royal yacht roles that required minimal armament but benefited from her size and comfort. Her most famous duty was transporting the royal family to South Africa in 1947. King George III, Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, and Princess Margaret embarked on January 31, 1947 for a tour of South Africa. The voyage lasted 4 months. Vanguard served as floating palace, her accommodations modified to provide royal suites, offices for government officials, and spaces for official functions. The South Africa tour demonstrated Vanguard's suitability as royal yacht. She was large enough to accommodate the royal party and their staff comfortably. She was stable enough that the royal family did not suffer seasickness. She was impressive enough to project British power and prestige during port visits. The tour was considered successful, and Vanguard was designated as preferred vessel for future royal tours requiring transoceanic travel. But the tour also highlighted the absurdity of using a battleship as passenger ship. Vanguard consumed 220 tons of fuel oil daily at cruising speed. The 4-month South Africa tour consumed approximately 26,000 tons of fuel, equivalent to the annual consumption of several destroyers. Operating the ship required a crew of 1,975 officers and ratings. The cost per day of operations exceeded the cost of chartering a luxury liner. After the South Africa tour, Vanguard returned to training duties. She served as flagship for the Home Fleet, conducted training cruises for midshipmen from Britannia. Royal Naval College, participated in NATO exercises, and represented Britain at international naval reviews. These were important duties, but not roles requiring a battleship. A cruiser or even a destroyer could have performed them equally well at fraction of the cost. The Admiralty recognized this reality. In 1954, serious discussions began about whether to maintain Vanguard in service or place her in reserve. The arguments for maintaining her in service were largely sentimental. She was the last British battleship, a symbol of naval tradition, a prestigious asset. The arguments against were practical. She was expensive, her armament was obsolete, and modern threats required different capabilities. The decision was to place her in reserve, but maintain her in condition that would allow rapid reactivation if needed. This compromise satisfied traditionalists who wanted to preserve the battleship while acknowledging budgetary realities. Vanguard was placed in reserve on August 22, 1955, after 9 years of active service. In reserve, she was maintained at reduced manning with skeleton crew performing preservation duties. The machinery was maintained, the hull was painted, the armament was preserved. She remained theoretically operational, able to return to service within weeks if international crisis required additional naval strength. But no crisis required a battleship. The Suez Crisis in 1956 required aircraft carriers and amphibious capabilities, not gunfire support. The Cold War required submarines, anti-submarine forces, and air defense, not battleships. Every operational requirement could be met by other ship types at lower cost. By 1960, maintaining Vanguard in reserve was costing approximately $500,000 per year without providing any operational capability. The Admiralty concluded that the money would be better spent on ships that addressed actual threats. The decision was made to scrap Vanguard. The announcement in July 1960 that Vanguard would be scrapped generated public controversy. Historical societies, naval veterans organizations, and naval enthusiasts protested. They argued that Vanguard should be preserved as museum ship, that she represented the end of Battleship era and should be maintained for historical education. Several preservation proposals were submitted, including plans to convert her to floating museum in Portsmouth or London. All proposals were rejected. The Admiralty estimated that converting Vanguard to museum ship would cost $2 million and annual maintenance would cost $100,000. No organization was willing to commit that level of funding. The ship was too large, too complex, and too expensive to preserve as museum. The decision to scrap was final. Vanguard was sold to Thomas Ward and Company for $500 on August 4, 1960. The sale price was slightly more than the annual cost of maintaining her in reserve, highlighting the financial burden she represented. Towing to the breakers began on August 9, 1960. She arrived at Faslane, Scotland on August 12, where scrapping began immediately. The scrapping was completed by 1962. Everything salvageable was removed, the 15-inch guns were cut up for scrap metal, the armor plates were recycled, the machinery was dismantled, the brass fittings were sold to dealers. A few small artifacts were preserved, a bell, some ships' crest, portions of interior woodwork. These were donated to museums or retained by the Royal Navy for historical collections. But the ship itself disappeared into scrap yards, reduced from 51,000 tons of battleship to tens of thousands of tons of recycled steel. Today, almost nothing remains of HMS Vanguard except photographs, technical drawings, and a handful of artifacts in museum collections. The Imperial War Museum displays some interior fittings. The Royal Navy Museum at Portsmouth holds technical documents. Private collectors own small memorabilia, nameplates, badges, ships, china. But the ship herself is gone, along with the battleship era she represented. The legacy of HMS Vanguard is complex and contradictory. She was technically the finest battleship Britain ever built, largest, most heavily armed, most protected, most comfortable. Her design incorporated lessons from 2 world wars. Her construction standards exceeded all previous British battleships. Her machinery was reliable, her handling was excellent, her seakeeping was superb. But she was also obsolete from conception, a solution to a 1939 problem completed in 1946 when the problem no longer existed. She was emergency battleship, built during an emergency that ended before she was finished. She represented the culmination of battleship design precisely when battleships ceased to be relevant. Her use of 30-year-old guns symbolized the entire project, making do with what was available rather than waiting for what was optimal. The 15-inch Mark I guns were fine weapons in 1916. They were adequate in 1946, but they were not optimal, not cutting edge, not the best possible choice. They were the compromise choice, the expedient choice, the choice made because Britain lacked time and resources to do better. This theme of compromise extended throughout Vanguard's design. She was not the battleship British naval architects would have designed in peacetime with unlimited budget and time. She was the battleship they could design given constraints of available guns, existing production capacity, and wartime resource allocation. She was the best battleship Britain could build under the circumstances, which was not the same as the best battleship Britain could imagine. Compared to contemporary battleships from other nations, Vanguard was respectable but not superior. The American Iowa class was faster, 33 knots versus 30 more heavily armed, 9 16-inch guns versus 8 15-inch, and better protected at long range. The French Richelieu class had equivalent speed and armament. The Italian Vittorio Veneto class was comparable in most respects. Only compared to older battleships did Vanguard demonstrate superiority, and that comparison was meaningless because older battleships were being scrapped while Vanguard was being built. She was better than King George III, better than Queen Elizabeth, better than Royal Oak. But those comparisons meant nothing in 1946 when the question was not whether Vanguard was better than older battleships, but whether any battleship was relevant to modern warfare. The answer demonstrated by Vanguard's operational career was no. Battleships were irrelevant. They were expensive, resource-intensive, vulnerable to modern weapons, and incapable of performing missions that could not be accomplished more efficiently by aircraft carriers, submarines, or guided missile cruisers. Vanguard proved this through her service 9 years of training duties and royal transport. No combat operations, no tactical relevance. The title of this narrative, The Unfinished Dream, refers not to Vanguard's construction, which was completed, but to the dream of battleship dominance that Vanguard represented. That dream ended during World War II when aircraft carriers and submarines proved more decisive than surface gunfire. But the dream persisted in naval circles among officers who had built careers around battleship warfare, who believed that massive armor and big guns remained relevant despite evidence otherwise. Vanguard was the final manifestation of that dream, the last attempt to build traditional naval power in an era when traditional naval power was obsolete. She was dream made real, then scrapped when reality could no longer sustain the dream. She was the unfinished dream because the vision of battleship dominance would never be fulfilled, could never be fulfilled, had been rendered impossible by technological and strategic changes that no amount of armor or gunnery could reverse. The phrase "too heavy for the treaties" in the title refers to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and London Naval Treaty of 1930, which limited battleship displacement to 35,000 tons standard. Vanguard displaced 44,500 tons standard, far exceeding treaty limits. But by the time she was built, the treaties had expired, replaced by World War II, where treaty limits were ignored. She was too heavy for treaties that no longer existed, a violation of restrictions that no longer applied, built to rules that had been abandoned. This was fitting. Vanguard violated obsolete restrictions, incorporated obsolete weapons, represented obsolete strategic thinking. She was anachronism from conception to scrapping the last expression of a naval philosophy that had been superseded by carriers, submarines, and guided missiles. She was the end of an era, the final capital ship, the last battleship, proof that even the finest example of a technology cannot survive when the technology itself becomes irrelevant. HMS Vanguard, Pennant No. 23, laid down October 2, 1941, launched May 3, 1946, commissioned April 25, 1946, scrapped 1960, 1962. Displacement 51,420 tons, full load. Armament 8 15-inch guns, manufactured 1914, 1916, 16 5.25-inch guns, 73 light anti-aircraft weapons. Crew 1975. Cost approximately $9 million, including armament. The largest battleship Britain ever built, completed after battleships were obsolete, armed with guns older than her crew, serving 9 years without firing shots in anger. The royal yacht that consumed 220 tons of fuel daily. The training ship that cost $500,000 annually to maintain in reserve. The museum ship that was too expensive to preserve. The scrap metal that was once the most powerful warship in the Royal Navy. The unfinished dream that was completely finished but represented vision that could never be completed. The culmination of centuries of naval architecture applied to a ship type that had no future. The finest battleship Britain built, completed precisely when battleships ceased to matter, serving only to demonstrate that excellence in obsolete technology remains obsolete, regardless of how excellent it might be.